And it's a warm welcome to you today. Something a little bit different because I still haven't managed to do the analysis of the following cue. It's hugely long and very intricate, and it's going to take me a while to do. And I've had other work, basically. So I thought instead we'd do a sort of shortish video looking at woodwind harmony and how you stack them. And I thought really the best way of doing this is to just go through cue by cue, and hopefully if we've done enough of them, then we'll start seeing a little pattern in the way things are done. Now, because Williams mostly orchestrates himself, and really the orchestrator is just sort of assigning parts, really just sort of writing them out in a full score, there's very little consideration that needs to be made, but there are some considerations, and I think it's worthwhile pointing them out because it's something that might enrich your woodwind light harmony as and when you use it. So let's have a look at it. So what I've done is I've gone through to the opening main title of A New Hope, and what I've done is I've basically short scored all the different sort of combinations which I think are worthwhile to do. In other words, if I don't think they're worthwhile, that means that everything is stacked. So if there are 3 clarinets, that means clarinet 1, clarinet 2 and clarinet 3 all stacked together, and that's sort of the norm basically. However, there are lots of instances where that isn't the norm, and we'll have a look at them and different sorts of ways of spacing wind. I'm not really dealing too much with bassoons and bass clarinet this particular episode because I wanted to just concentrate on one thing at a time. So what I've done is I've gone through, as I've said, the main title, and I've delineated all the different sorts of things. So we have Unison, which is just stacked, light harmony, which is just stacked in the normal registers of things. So flutes at the top, oboes, clarinets. But of course, often the oboes and the clarinets are sort of interchangeable, these oboes and clarinets. The flutes generally tend to be stacked regardless, but there are instances where even that is not stacked. But it's very unusual for flutes to have any form of enclosure with anything else. It just doesn't work because of the register involved and the volume. But it's interesting to see how this all comes about. We'll see. So the very, very first chord, and if I can, I'll sort of try and flip between the sort of two things. So the very first chord here is, here we go. Okay. And there might be something slightly different with my version because I believe there were actually 4 flutes in the very original recording, but the score, orchestrated score or sketch does not survive. Nobody has it, but I orally dictated this a little bit, just in terms of like the 4th trumpet, for example, which is completely missing. There's an extra harp gliss which doesn't appear in the concert version. All sorts of different things which are slightly different, but it shouldn't really detract from the main sort of thing. So what I've done is gone through the main thing. So here we've got piccolo and flute right at the very, very top. And we'll do this sort of in stages. So piccolo and flute right at the very top, absolutely ludicrously high. So I suppose if you really want to be pedantic, it's piccolo and then flute. So we could do that and then flute. So with this one, it just has one of those things on. So extremely, so the absolute extremes of the register. Then we've got flute 2, oboe 1 and clarinet 1 all sharing that B flat. So let's just reiterate that. Flute 2, oboe 1 and clarinet 1 all sharing that particular note. And it's because it's a strong register. So obviously the root note, and it's got sort of, the flute 2 won't be heard really, even at that register. To be perfectly frank, but it's just flavouring those 3 instruments to combine. So it's an interesting thing to do. Then we only have oboe 2 and clarinet 2 on the octave below that, and then the octave below that is the bass clarinet, then an octave below that, bassoon 1, and then bassoon 2 and contra sharing the bottom B flat, which is the lowest note on bassoon. Interesting that, really, because more often than not, the bassoon 2 is in unison with bassoon 1, but not in this instance. So it actually shares that note. Notice that the contrabassoon does not play the octave lower. I've never seen that in anything that Williams has done in Star Wars, but of course I've only looked at that. I haven't looked at anything else, so it could be that he does it all over the place in different and other things, but I haven't seen it anywhere else. So we then move on, and I've then sort of bar numbered most of the other sort of little bits here. So light harmony, when it's sort of, you know, 3 notes to a chord, is just generally stacked, and that's just an example here where we have that sort of chordal, that sort of idea, little light harmony, oboe 1 at the top, oboe 2, then the clarinet 1 at the bottom. So that is quite common, and that's just from bar 2. So let's just do a little bar number there, just to be consistent. And then when we have this interesting sort of blended orchestration here, where we have all these sort of trills and things, what's actually going on? So we have piccolo right at the very top, then flute 1 takes the note below, then flute 2 and clarinet 1 share the B flat. So there's some element of unison doubling in these. And then we have clarinet 2 at the bottom. And then notice that at the very end, we have a sort of interesting doubling thing going on, so that the piccolos and flutes all share that F. The flute 2 goes up into the E flat, I think. Or does it? I can't remember where this is now. Yeah, so actually the flute 2 does go up into the E flat. The high F is just the flute 1 and the piccolo, so as I've said before, so those actually share those notes. The piccolo and the flute share that F. Then flute 2. Then we get clarinet 2 and clarinet 1, and basically on that F. So clarinet 1 and clarinet 2 on there. So it's actually quite an intricate sort of idea. I'm sure that must be rather hard to trill. I don't know. Any flute players or whatever might be interested, instead of having a fifth. You know, it's that sort of, you know, quite tricky. And the same thing like that. Obviously, I've played it an octave too low, but there we go. So it's sort of interesting sort of little bit, and that it does vary that. And often you have to be a little bit inventive, because of course there are only sort of 3 or even 2 notes in the whole thing. That's why I've called it sort of light harmony. It's not necessarily the whole of the chord, and sometimes it's just, you know, part of a chord, or it could be a sort of chordal chord as well. And then moving on, we have this thing which is quite common, where the flutes themselves are stacked. So we have piccolo, then flute 1, then flute 2 on the bottom note. Then we have oboe 1, then clarinet 1, then oboe 2, and then clarinet 2. So a sort of interlocking idea there. So a sort of thing like that. Oboes there and clarinets there. And these are all sort of little things which you'll find in Rimsky-Korsakov. So they are still used. But often the flutes themselves are actually stacked, whereas this one, they're interlocked. But it's not always interlocked. And we'll see sometimes they're enclosed. So in this, we have a full harmony tetrachord. So it's one of his, you know, usual sort of, major chord with a flat 6. So what happens is that instead of having oboe 1, oboe 2, clarinet 2, he often blends them. So that we have, when I say he, this could be either Williams or Herb or both. Spencer, that is. So we have, oboe 1, then clarinet 1 on the G, then oboe 2, and then clarinet 2. So it's a type of interlock. That's from bar 68. And we can just sort of, I think if I just do that, I can just do that. So it's the Starry Night sequence. So we can see oboe 1, then clarinet 1, then oboe 2, then that. So we get this sound. like that. So there is a certain amount of differentiation in that as well. And this is the thing that I would ask practitioners to sort of do, is go through every single score if you can, and then delineate every single example of how things differ. So when we get into the full harmony, where we have 4 different notes basically, but also ones which are not necessarily a triad, but sort of a tetrachord of some description. This one is sort of another suspended chord. Again, the flutes are stacked, so piccolo, flute 1, flute 2, but then we've got oboe 1, then clarinet 1, then clarinet 2, and then oboe 2. So actually in this instance, the oboes are enclosing the clarinets like that. And so it's a slightly different context. And sometimes they're just standalone chords like this, just a long chord. When we go on to 84, here it's this big sort of Holst bit. So if we just take those upper winds. So it's a really interesting sort of blend at that point. As I said before, piccolo right at the top, then flute 1, then flute 2, then oboe 1, then the clarinets, both clarinets together, and then oboe 2 an octave below that. So we get a different sort of blend at that stage as well. You'll notice also in the brass, it's slightly different, but often stacked, really. Very occasionally we've got trombones sort of going into the realm of the horns as well, but not all the notes, which is quite common in sort of jazz big band music, where let's say these are more open, but often with a little semitonal shift, whereas everything's just in closed position in the horns. So it's sort of, generally speaking, more open in trombones and trumpets and less open in horns. Anyway, we'll deal with brass another time. So an interesting one there. And then at bar 95, again, we've got our sort of stacked flutes at the top. So piccolo, flute 1, flute 2. But then we've got an interesting bit where we're sharing, a little bit like before with that register, that sort of one ledger line above the stave. We've got oboe 1 and clarinet 1 sharing that B, then oboe 2, then clarinet 2. So we've got a slightly different, more stacked form, but with a unison doubling on the sort of the fifth of the chord, so not even the root of that, which I find really interesting. But it's to do with register rather than harmonic function, I think, really, just to get the best out of those instruments. So I just find it really interesting. Right, let's go to bar 95 and have a quick look. It's not far, so I won't bother doing that too much. So here we go. There we go. A sort of cheery sound. And we'll see, again, the oboe and the clarinet are playing together. Like that. Don't forget this is piccolo, so it sounds an octave higher. So even though it looks as though it's unison, it's not. So worth bearing in mind. And then, generally speaking, those roles aren't changed in a line. Generally speaking, they stay the same. But not always. Sometimes there is a change of register halfway through a line, and that's something to bear in mind. So the last of these sorts of things is this triadic harmony in second inversion. So in other words, 4 notes with one double note. So in this case, it's the fifth of the chord that's doubled. And so the root, which would be that. So here... And in this instance, we've got flute 1, flute 2, flute 3. So they would normally be in their normal spacing. However, the flute 1 is the only one on that high D, partly because it's possibly a little bit too piercing for the clarinet and also the oboe at that point as well. And then we've got flute 2 with clarinet 1. So the clarinets are now above the oboes. So normally flutes, oboes, clarinets. Now it's flutes, clarinets and oboes. With the clarinets and the flutes being blended. So flute 2 and clarinet 1, flute 3 and clarinet 2, and then the oboes on that unison note. So again, it's going to sound quite strong because that's in a good register for the oboes as well. And also it will sound strong and triadic because of the blended sound of clarinets and flutes up at the top as well. So let's have a look at that. 108. Here we go. So it's just after all this triadic stuff. Does exactly the same thing, and it continues. So if I just take those oboes together, we can see that they're in unison all the way through. So again, it doesn't really change at all at that point. But it's interesting that those things are above those oboes. The clarinets are above those oboes. Because the oboes are defining the principal note, which is the D. And of course you can see it blended. And again, this is just woodwinds on its own. So we'll see another time where you then have to go, okay, well then how do they fit in with everything else? That's another ball game as well. So we're just separating it out first, and then we have to put it all together again. So what we'll do is we'll revisit all of those and go, well, okay, that's great, but then how do they relate to everything else? Is it blended? Is it differentiated orchestration? In other words, are just the strings doing the melody and the woodwind and the brass are doing the harmony, or is it more blended, in which case everything is combined? So we will do more of that another time. But I just wanted to get you into this to begin with. So there we go. Next thing, thickening a line, a melody, just in thirds, basically. Obos 1, Oboe 2, very common. Same thing with the clarinet. So it was just putting it there just to sort of really have it there. Generally speaking, if there was another note, another thing below, and he didn't have a cor anglais, he would just put a clarinet beneath. So often we would have two oboes, then a clarinet beneath. Here we've got our familiar 0811 sort of spacing, or 3/3 is the set. So interestingly enough, there's no A flat at all in the voicing. So we have piccolo and flute 2 at the top, not flute 1, which is a bit strange. I would have just put flute 1. Flute 2 here. So usually you would have piccolo, flute 1, flute 2, but in this case it's piccolo, flute 2, then flute 1. But then clarinet 1, then oboe 1 and clarinet 2, and then oboe 2 and bass clarinet. So it's a slightly different sort of type of stacking with some unison blends in it. And it's this bit here. This whole passage is the same. Like that. This sort of angular form of melody going on at that point. And so again, it just completely just sticks to what it was. So it's interesting that the flute here is on its own with the clarinet 1 on its own, and then the only blends are these, which I find again quite interesting. But we've only got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 notes, and so the ones which don't need blending, the ones in a good singable register. The ones that are blended tend to be in sort of slightly perhaps awkward bits. Maybe that clarinet is sort of just about on the break of the different fingers. So then we're moving on to 149, another stacking variant here of the same thing, but a different register. So we have piccolo right at the very top, then an octave lower, flute 1, then the third in the flute 2, then clarinet 1, then oboe 1 and clarinet 2, and then oboe 2 and bass clarinet at the end. So that's in 149. So a slightly different bit here. You'll remember this bit, I'm sure. And really, the piccolo really stands out at that point, doesn't it? It's very, very high indeed. Then moving on to a completely different sort of thing, where we have moving harmonic accompaniments. So in this case, I am introducing some bassoons here because we can just see how, again, really just stacking is the norm. So even with these sort of close position ideas, we've got clarinet 1, clarinet 2, no attempt to sort of try and have a something consonant with the same instrument group. No, just make it, just don't worry, just stack it. Again, very, very common to just have stacked. It's tempting to go clarinet 1, bassoon 1, clarinet 2, bassoon 2. No, it's fine. Just, have them in. Bassoons in thirds sound great anyway. So it's obviously a discord. Doesn't matter. So I think sometimes when people are studying Rimsky, you can sort of get into the illusion that you should attempt to have concordance with any of the same family all the time, but that's not necessarily the case at all. Certainly not in film music, and certainly not in the Williams scores that we've been studying, because it isn't that way, because I've just said and shown that it isn't. So let's have a quick look at that. So 254. And yeah, again, we can see, look, the trombones are sort of doing the same sort of thing, really. And it's just the bassoons and the clarinets, which are quite good at moving. Good idea of the breaths as well, and they have a real phrase to go over as well. Notice that the horns are doing exactly the same thing in this stretch, with plenty of rests. And they're doing exactly the same thing all the way through, and it's this wonderful bit, where the sort of just such a great sort of bit of music at that point. And actually, we come on to an interesting different variant of the triadic homophony that we had before. So previously, I think right at the very beginning, we had just stacked oboe1, oboe2, clarinet. What happens here is we get oboe1, then clarinet 1, then oboe2. So the clarinet is doing that middle A note, whereas the oboes are enclosing it. So it's another form of enclosure. So we can just do that, which is good to highlight. And again, it doesn't change anywhere through that sort of bar, through the phrase rather. So here we can hear it like that. You get a really nice blend, and then it repeats exactly the same way. There's no attempt to change the coloration of that. Where some orchestrators might perhaps over-orchestrate and do something a little bit different, but Williams doesn't. Here it's an interesting one where we have diadic harmony, so not 3 notes but 2 notes, which is this third to sixths. Often that happens. We'll see it in the Phantom Menace all over the place. So this one, Flute 1, Flute 2, and then Flute 3 and Clarinet 1, and then Clarinet 2 at the bottom. So again, it's quite an interesting little bit here. So no oboes in this. Like that, sort of rather pure, rather thin sound, actually, in some ways. Let's see how it appears with those divided strings. There we go. Interesting. And then right at the very, very end, this sort of Death Star idea here. So we have rich triadic harmony against a different bass. So this is where it does break into different sorts of things. So we've got our usual Flute 1, Flute 2, Flute 3 as stacked. Then we've got oboe 1 and 2 unison, again on that sort of middle note, that sort of root position, root note, but then it changes. Then we got clarinet 1, clarinet 2, bass clarinet. So a sort of stacking, really, apart from the oboes, which are in unison. But then it changes on the change of chord. So here we're changing inversion, but it's all the same spacing in terms of the instruments. But on the change of chord, flute 1, flute 2, flute 3. But then oboe 1, then clarinet 1, then clarinet 2, and oboe 2, which I think is interesting. So there we go. Oboe 1, clarinet 1, clarinet 2, then oboe 2. So it does change halfway through, and that's right at the sort of very end of the cue. So it's this bit here. Like that, and then it diminuendos all the way through. And it's interesting because I would have thought that actually having the oboe on the bass kind of is quite tangy and prominent. I would have perhaps swapped over those and had the C here. And the beauty of having something like a notation software program is that we can just change it and go, well, how does that sound? Is that any better? I think it's going to be... I think it probably is a bit better, to be perfectly honest, because the G is going to sort of it's much easier to diminuendo in that clarinet. But I suppose then you're going to have the C still ringing. But then would you rather have the C or the G? I don't know. It's one of those sort of conundrums where it could just be literal personal choice of the orchestrator as to what to do. And the fact that, generally speaking, he tends to enclose clarinets in the oboes in the outer. So this bit is the oboes and these are the clarinets. It does tend to do that. So we've seen that quite a lot. In fact, the only one that isn't enclosured, apart from stacking, was that thing right at the very, very beginning, I think. Sort of this interlock idea here, which is actually more rare than you might think, interestingly. So that enclosure seems to be something that sort of does occur a little bit more. Otherwise, stacking and those odd sort of unison bits seem to be the norm. So I just thought it'd be useful to sort of do that. Again, sort of enclosure of oboes with the clarinet in the middle. Again, oboe 1, then clarinets in the middle, oboe 2. So again, another enclosure there. Hopefully, sorry, that was the one that I can't use the same example for the other example. That'd be ridiculous. But I think you kind of get the drift. Here it's almost the same, sort of oboe 1, then no, it's more interlocked at that point, isn't it? Oboe 1, clarinet 1, then oboe 2, then clarinet 2. So a mixture of those things. But here we do have an interlock. So those are the clarinets and the oboes are playing those octaves. So interesting. Mixture of some interlocking, mixture of enclosure. At least we now know, is there a correlation between interlocking in terms of the register? Maybe. Possibly, he tends to have oboe in the bottom. So that there could be a thing about that. I don't know until we do a few more of these, and then we can sort of make a sort of judgment call on it. But anyway, I hope that you've enjoyed that sort of rather short episode about woodwind harmony in Star Wars, specifically in this cue. When we do a little bit more, and it'll be something that I can just sort of throw in from time to time, which hopefully you will find useful. So, I hope you'll now spend a week where you have sort of harmonic ideas in your winds, and you can sort of start sort of mix and matching them. Don't forget that the usual thing is just stacking, then we've got sort of interlocking, and then enclosure. Generally speaking, oboes, and then the clarinets, not the other way round. I haven't seen that yet. So that's worth bearing in mind. So that's all for now, folks. See you again soon, and look forward to bringing you the next cue as and when. Bye-bye.